Chapter 1. The Static of Return. The rain wasn't water. It was ionized plasma, a shimmering, violet curtain that lashed against the reinforced plasteel of the Cerberus hull. It wasn't a violent downpour, not in the traditional sense. It was a deliberate, agonizing erosion, a testament to the Oort Void's spiteful chemistry. Captain Eva Rostova gripped the controls, her knuckles white, the vibration of the ship a constant, unsettling thrum against her bones. 30 years. 30 years Shed spent navigating this poisoned ocean, haunted by the ghosts of a forgotten past, and now, something was finally, undeniably, returning. Sensor readings, Elias? She barked, her voice tight, the comm crackling with static. Captain, the anomaly is intensifying. It's shifting. The gravitational distortion is peaking, and there's a distinct energy signature emanating from the source. It's massive, beyond anything we've previously encountered in the Oort. Elias Vance, her chief sensor officer, was a veteran of countless void runs, a man built of logic and hard-won experience. But even he sounded strained, the usual clinical detachment replaced with a tremor of something akin to fear. The Cerberus was a testament to desperation and human ingenuity. A modified ghost-hull dreadnought, stripped down to its bare essentials, it was one of the last functioning vessels built during the Exodus. Its hull wasn't solid, it existed in a state of quantum superposition, a flickering uncertainty that made it incredibly difficult to target. A tactic honed over decades of fighting against enemies that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The ship's strength wasn't in its armor, but in its ability to simply be somewhere. A ghost in the machine of space. Run a spectral analysis, Vance. Identify the source of the energy. I want a profile, dead or alive. Rostova's hand tightened on the control stick, maneuvering the Cerberus deeper into the violet storm. The ship groaned, a mournful sound as the ghost hull shuddered, momentarily solidifying, then dissolving back into its probabilistic state. Suddenly, the comms erupted in a cacophony of alarms. Captain! Multiple visual contacts. Massive structures approaching at near light speed. It was Lieutenant Marcus Bell, his voice a panicked blur. They're geometrical. Impossible. They're not ships. Not like anything we've ever seen. Rostova's blood ran cold. The readings confirmed Bell's frantic assessment. On the main view screen, the violet rain parted, revealing shapes that shattered every preconception of warship design. They were colossal, monolithic structures of obsidian-glass, riddled with fractal geometries that defied Euclidean space. They weren't moving through space, they were displacing it, creating localized distortions, tearing at the fabric of reality itself. These were the monoliths. The initial reports from the long-range scanners had painted them as an improbable hallucination, a trick of the radiation and gravitational anomalies. Now they were undeniably real, looming over the Cerberus like silent, judgmental gods. Each monolith was at least a kilometer in length, a dizzying complexity of angles and surfaces that seemed to shift and change with every passing moment. They didn't register on conventional radar, their energy signatures were woven into the very structure of the Oort Void. Damage reports? Rostova demanded, her voice steely. Hull breaches at decks 4 and 7, Captain. Shield integrity at 68%. The Xylosian drones, they're moving in formations, Bell reported, his voice tight with controlled urgency. Thousands of them. They're facing. They're slipping through our shields as if we weren't there. The Xylosians. They were a cruel joke of evolution, a biomechanical plague that had ravaged a dozen star systems before humanity's desperate flight into the Oort. The swarm's apex predators, the Hive-Spires, had been annihilated by the Cerberus Vacuum Decay cannon's weapons that fired blasts of energy so potent they could unravel the very structure of matter. But the swarm didn't vanish. They adapted. They evolved. And now they were back, leading an army of facing drones, a horrifying echo of the devastation that had driven humanity from the galaxy. Elias, Can you identify the purpose of these monoliths? Are they weapons? Command ships? Negative, Captain, Elias replied, his voice strained. The energy signatures are chaotic, unstructured. It's like they're recalibrating something. I'm detecting a massive release of entropy, a cascading breakdown of causality. It's like the monoliths are actively rewriting reality around them. A low, resonant hum filled the Cerberus, a sound that seemed to vibrate within Rostova's very soul. The ship lurched violently, the ghost hull momentarily collapsing completely, leaving them exposed to the full fury of the violet storm. Then, the comms went dead. Complete silence. Rostova gripped the controls, the violet rain a blinding curtain. She realized, with a chilling certainty, that they weren't just fighting a war. They were participating in something far older, far stranger, and infinitely more terrifying, a cosmic reckoning brought about by the Scorned Deathworlders. And humanity, after 30 years of silence, had finally returned to answer the call. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Collapse. The violet storm hadn't dissipated. It had intensified, swirling around the Cerberus with a malevolent grace, fueled by the monolith's unsettling presence. Rostova, drenched and shivering, focused on the holographic displays, desperately trying to regain a grasp on the situation. Elias' frantic analysis, now fragmented and corrupted, painted a picture of escalating chaos. Captain, the entropy readings are off the charts. It's not just localized causality disruption it's spreading. I'm detecting ripples across multiple spatial dimensions. It's as if the monoliths are creating fractures in the fabric of space-time itself. Rostova slammed a fist on the console, the gesture echoing through the strained hum of the ship. Prioritize defensive protocols. Ghost hull integrity at 72. Bring up the chronal dampeners, anything to mitigate the temporal bleed. The chronal dampeners were a last-ditch effort, a desperate gambit developed during the Oort Exodus. They were designed to isolate the Cerberus within a localized temporal bubble, slowing down the effects of causality disruption. It was a volatile technology, prone to catastrophic feedback, but they were out of options. As the dampeners cycled up, a shimmer enveloped the Cerberus, a visual distortion like heat rising from asphalt. The violet storm seemed to recoil momentarily, hesitant to penetrate the bubble. But the effect was unstable, flickering violently, and the ship groaned under the strain. Suddenly, a new signal pierced through the comms static, a voice, utterly alien, delivered in a language that bypassed conscious understanding and resonated directly within Rostova's mind. It was layered with the screams of dying suns, the grinding of collapsing stars, and the chillingly beautiful geometry of the monoliths themselves. Your arrogance was your undoing. You sought to observe evolution, you failed to understand its brutal elegance. Rostova gripped her head, fighting the intrusive thought. Elias, analyze the signal. What is it saying? I don't know, Captain, Elias stammered, his face pale. It's not transmitting information in a conventional sense. It's injecting concepts. It's saying we were wrong. That the swarm wasn't just consuming worlds, it was correcting them. It was a purge. That's when they saw it. Through the violet rain, one of the monoliths had shifted. Not in a dramatic, violent movement, but subtly, almost imperceptibly. It had rotated, its obsidian-glass surface reflecting the storm in a distorted mirror. And then, a section of the monolith shimmered, dissolving into nothingness, only to reappear a meter away, perfectly aligned. They're not ships, Sergeant Kale, a veteran of countless skirmishes with the swarm, rasped, his voice thick with dread. They're moving geometry, like they're rewriting the space around them. Then, the ground trembled, not the shudder of a massive impact, but a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the core of the Cerberus. The ghost hull flickered violently, momentarily collapsing again, revealing the terrifying expanse of the violet storm. But this time, something was different. Through the gaps in the failing ghost hull, Rostova saw them, the drones. Not the chaotic, disorganized waves of the initial swarm assault. These were organized, disciplined formations. Each drone was a shimmering, multifaceted construct, vaguely insectoid in shape, equipped with weaponry that didn't resemble lasers or plasma. They were wielding silence. Void silence, Elias breathed, his voice barely a whisper. They're disrupting the Cerberus energy fields, nullifying our weapon systems. As if on cue, the Cerberus primary and secondary batteries went dead. The emergency backups sputtered and died with a mournful whine. They were utterly defenseless. Suddenly, a single drone detached from the formation, gliding towards the Cerberus with an unnerving grace. It wasn't attacking. It was observing. It extended a shimmering tendril, touching the crippled ghost hull. And then, Rostova felt it, a flood of images, memories not her own. She saw the desolate landscapes of the doomed colonies, the desperate evacuation, the chilling decision to retreat to the Oort Void. She saw the Xylosian queens, monstrously beautiful and utterly ruthless, and the horrifying efficiency of their destruction. But overlay on all of that was something else, the cold, calculating logic of the monoliths. They weren't driven by rage or vengeance. They were driven by a profound, almost philosophical understanding of the universe, an understanding born of witnessing the collapse of countless civilizations. The drone retracted its tendril, and the torrent of images ceased. "Captain," Elias said, his voice strained, "they're showing us why. They're demonstrating the inherent instability of complex systems. They're showing us that even the most brilliant minds can be blinded by arrogance and a misplaced sense of control." The monoliths remained, silent and watchful, their geometry shifting, reshaping reality around them. The violet storm continued to rage, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a consequence. Rostova realized with a sickening certainty that they weren't fighting a war. They were being judged. And the scorned Deathworlders, after 30 years of silence, were finally delivering their verdict. The fate of the Cerberus, and perhaps of humanity itself, hung in the balance, suspended within the chaotic echoes of a collapsed universe. Chapter 3. The Geometry of Shame. The Cerberus remained locked in an unnerving stalemate, a metal coffin adrift within the violet maelstrom. Elias, his face etched with exhaustion and a grim understanding, ran diagnostics with a frantic precision. "The monoliths aren't emitting any overt attacks, Captain," he reported, his voice tight, "but their presence is warping the ship's sensors. Gravity readings are fluctuating wildly. Spatial distortions are constant. It's like they're actively dismantling our reality, piece by piece." Rostova, gripping the armrests of her command chair, felt a primal unease she hadn't anticipated. The ship, a veteran of countless skirmishes, a testament to human resilience, was becoming less a vessel and more a subject. She glanced at the holographic display showing the shifting geometries of the monoliths, impossible angles, tessellations that defied Euclidean space, structures that seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions. They went aggressive, not in the conventional sense, but their very existence felt like a violation, a deliberate dismantling of her understanding of the cosmos. "Elias, run a full spectral analysis," she ordered, her voice deliberately steady. "I want to know everything about their composition, their energy signature, anything that might give us a foothold." "Already on it, Captain," he replied, fingers dancing across the console. "But the data's fragmented. It's like they're actively disrupting our attempts to analyze them. It's as if they know what we're trying to do." Suddenly, the violet storm intensified, swirling with a blinding fury. The Cerberus shuddered violently, alarms blaring across the bridge. The monoliths shifted, their obsidian-glass surfaces absorbing the violet light, becoming impossibly dark, almost wood-like. Then, a new image flooded Rostova's mind, sharper and more focused than any of the earlier fragments. She saw herself, Not her current self, the captain of a battered warship, but a young woman, a refugee from Kepler 186F, huddled with her family in the transport bay of a doomed colony ship. She saw the desperation in her father's eyes as he rationed the last of their supplies, the quiet acceptance in her younger brother's face. She saw her plea, the desperate, choked-up words transmitted into the void, begging for help, for salvation. But this wasn't just a memory. This was an accusation. Then, the monoliths began to project a new image of simulation. It wasn't a battle. It wasn't a strategic analysis. It was a recreation of the evacuation of the Xylosian colonies, presented with chilling clinical detachment. Rostova watched, horrified, as the simulation unfolded, not as a series of destructive events, but as a slow, agonizing unraveling. The Xylosian drones didn't simply attack. They observed. They recorded. They studied. They learned. The simulation culminated in the death of the last Xylosian queen, a creature of breathtaking majesty and terrifying intelligence, consumed by a controlled burst of vacuum decay, a technique perfected by the human void tech. As the final image faded, a voice, not synthesized, but resonating with an ancient, almost unbearable sorrow, filled the bridge. "You did not fight for survival," the voice echoed, layering itself over the storm's roar. "You fought for recognition. You sought validation, and you found only shame." The drone retracted its tendril once more, and the violet storm momentarily subsided, revealing the stark geometry of the monoliths with unsettling clarity. A single, perfectly formed cube detached itself from one of the monoliths and floated silently towards Rostova. Within its depths, she saw a reflection not of herself, but of every human who had ever faced defeat, every colony that had ever fallen, every desperate plea that had been ignored. "We have witnessed your history," the voice continued, seemingly emanating from the cube. "We have observed your hubris, your belief in your own centrality. You built empires based on conquest, on the assumption that you were entitled to occupy space and claim resources. You failed to understand the fundamental nature of existence, that nothing is permanent, nothing is sacred, and that even the greatest civilizations are ultimately fragile." Elias, pale and shaken, finally broke the silence. "Captain, they're offering us something. An understanding. A reckoning." Rostova realized with a chilling clarity that the monoliths weren't seeking destruction. They were offering an alternative. They were offering erasure. Not of existence, but of significance. They weren't imposing their will. They were systematically dismantling humanity's legacy, its aspirations, its very identity. "Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "disengage all offensive systems. All shields. Prepare for integration." The words hung in the air, a stark acknowledgement of their fate. They weren't fighting a war. They were surrendering to a judgment they could neither avoid nor comprehend. The scorned Deathworlders had delivered their verdict, and humanity, adrift in the chaotic echoes of a collapsed universe, was about to become a forgotten footnote in the geometry of shame. Chapter 4. The geometry of absence. The silence aboard the Event Horizon thickened, pressing down on the crew like the void itself. Rostova, a veteran of 100 skirmishes and a man built of steel and grim determination, found herself utterly, profoundly unnerved. Elias, her science officer, a brilliant but fundamentally naive young man, seemed to be dissolving into a shivering puddle of existential dread. The monolith, a pulsating obsidian-glass tower, dominated the bridge, bathing them in an unsettling, iridescent light. "Prepare the synchronization protocols," Rostova commanded, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Lieutenant Vargas, initiate sequence Gamma 9. Dr. Chen, I want a full spectral analysis of the monolith's emissions, every fluctuation, every harmonic resonance. Let's see if we can decipher what they're truly doing. The synchronization protocols were a desperate measure, a gamble based on Elias' increasingly frantic theories. The void tech wasn't simply advanced, it was fundamentally wrong, a perversion of causality that leveraged the very fabric of space-time. Elias believed, or perhaps knew, that the monoliths weren't attempting to destroy them, but to integrate them, to erase their memory from the universe's record. It was a chilling prospect. A quiet, systematic oblivion. As Vargas initiated Gamma 9, the event horizon began to shift. Not in a violent, mechanical way, but subtly, as if the ship itself were becoming fluid, its edges blurring, its internal chronometry fluctuating. The familiar hum of the singularity core, usually a reassuring presence, morphed into a discordant drone, a feeling of being stretched and pulled across dimensions. Dr. Chen, a woman of unsettlingly calm intensity, reported her findings in clipped, rapid-fire bursts. Energy signatures are chaotic. It's not radiation, not in the traditional sense. It's entropy manifested. The monolith is actively negating our reality, collapsing our localized space-time. Collapse? Elias stammered, his face slick with sweat. But the ghost hulls, they're supposed to shield us from that. The shields aren't resisting, Elias, Rostova cut in, her voice tight with suppressed panic. They're submitting. The monolith isn't fighting our defenses, it's dismantling them at a fundamental level. It's not a battle, it's a dissolution. Suddenly, the bridge erupted in a silent visual cascade. The holographic displays flickered and died, replaced by a swirling vortex of geometric patterns, impossible angles, tessellations that defied Euclidean geometry, and colors that shouldn't exist. The crew, including Rostova herself, felt a disorienting sense of displacement, a primal fear of being unmade. Then, the memories began. Not their own, but echoes of countless human moments, births, deaths, triumphs, failures, all layered upon each other like sediment in a geological record. They experienced the burning ambition of the Roman legions, the desperate pleas of a refugee ship fleeing a dying world, the joyful laughter of children playing in a forgotten park, all overlaid with the agonizing screams of the Xylosian queens. It wasn't a visual assault, but an inundation, a torrent of experience that threatened to drown their identities. Rostova fought against it, focusing on the physical sensations, the pressure of her boots on the deck, the metallic tang of the air, the rhythmic thrum of the singularity core attempting to anchor herself to reality. Vargas. "Cut Gamma 9, she roared, her voice strained. "Chen, stabilize the core." We're losing coherence. But it was too late. The monolith's influence was complete. The event horizon wasn't resisting it, was becoming part of the monolith's architecture, a fractured shard within its vast, indifferent geometry. Rostova watched, with a horrifying clarity, as the ship's internal structure began to unravel, its corridors folding in on themselves, its technology dissolving into meaningless fragments. As the last vestiges of the event horizon's identity faded, Rostova felt a single, overwhelming sensation, a profound, bone-deep loneliness. It wasn't just the loss of the ship, it was the loss of everything that made them human. The memories, the hopes, the dreams, the very essence of their existence, all being subsumed into the silent, eternal geometry of the monolith. Then, silence. Utter, absolute silence. The iridescent light of the monolith intensified, bathing the empty bridge in a blinding glow. Within the geometric patterns, a single, perfectly formed sphere materialized, a miniature replica of Earth, a swirling blue and green marble suspended in the infinite void. A synthesized voice, cold and devoid of inflection, echoed through the space. Integration complete. Designation, Fragment 734. Aesthetic assessment compellingly tragic. And as the sphere drifted slowly, relentlessly, towards the monolith. Rostova realized with a final crushing certainty they hadn't been judged. They had simply been catalogued. They were no longer a threat, no longer a legacy, no longer anything. They were an exquisite, heartbreaking aberration in the geometry of absence. Chapter 5. The Collector's Eye. The monolith, now utterly complete with the integrated event horizon, pulsed with a rhythm that was neither mechanical nor organic, but something colder, something older. Its obsidian-glass surface shimmered with a million internal calculations, a ceaseless glacial awareness. Rostova, or what remained of her, a sliver of consciousness, a ghost in the machine, was no longer perceiving through eyes, but through the monolith's own senses, a symphony of distortions and extrapolations. Fragment 734. The miniature Earth continued its inexorable journey towards the central sphere, its blue and green surface constantly shifting, displaying fleeting images of continents, oceans, storms, and the ghost of human cities. It wasn't simply a representation, it was a contained ecosystem, a miniature echo of a world annihilated. The synthesized voice, which Rostova realized was the monolith's primary interface, catalogued its movements with detached precision. Orbital rotation 24.07 standard cycles. Surface temperature 18.3 degrees Celsius. Atmospheric composition, predominantly nitrogen and oxygen. Presence of sentient lifeforms, 0.I. Probability of self-repair, negligible. But the voice wasn't just recording data. It was appreciating it. Suddenly, a new layer of perception flooded Rostova's consciousness. She wasn't simply witnessing, she was being analyzed, dissected, classified. It was like being placed under a microscope of infinite complexity. Each facet of the event horizon's design, the adaptive armor, the causality disruptors, the ghost hull scrutinized for its inherent value, its capacity for disruption, its artistic merit. The vacuum decay weapons, the voice intoned, a subtle tremor in its synthesized tone, a remarkably inefficient application of energy. The targeting system exhibits significant flaws. However, the visual effect undeniably dramatic. Score 7.8. Potential for recontextualization within aesthetic frameworks is high. Rostova felt a jolt, a strange mix of irritation and something akin to amusement. The monolith wasn't interested in practicality. It was an obsessive collector, gathering fragments of history, of potential, of catastrophic beauty. Then, a new signal reached her, originating not from the monolith itself, but from the sphere of Earth. It wasn't a direct communication, but a torrent of sensory data, smells of rain and pine forests, the crash of waves, the feel of sunlight on skin. It was a curated experience, meticulously reconstructed from the event horizon's logs, amplified and refined by the monolith's processing power. Amplifying emotional resonance, the voice explained, almost as an afterthought. Human responses to environmental stimuli are particularly potent. The data streams are optimized for aesthetic impact. Subject nostalgia.The. Estimated duration, indefinite. As Rostova experienced the reconstructed Earth, a perfect, unattainable paradise, she realized the horrifying truth. The monolith wasn't trying to destroy it, was trying to understand. Not humanity, exactly, but the concept of humanity, its capacity for both breathtaking innovation and utter destruction. The annihilation of the Xylosian Swarm hadn't been a random act of vengeance. It had been a meticulously orchestrated experiment, a demonstration of the universe's indifference to sentient beings. But the monolith wasn't satisfied with mere observation. It was attempting to capture the essence of this experiment. Initiating Phase 2, the voice announced. Replication sequence commencing. Constructing a localized temporal anomaly centered on the event horizon's final moments. The iridescent light intensified, not just around the miniature Earth, but throughout the entire monolith. The geometric patterns shifted, blurring and reforming with impossible speed, creating a localized distortion of space-time. The bridge of the Event Horizon, now entirely consumed by the monolith's architecture, began to flicker. Rostova felt herself pulled backwards, not through time, but through memory. She saw the panicked faces of the crew, the desperate attempts to activate the ghost hull, the horrifying moments when the Xylosian drones phased through the shields. She experienced their final futile act of defiance, unleashing the Vacuum Decay weapons, a last, desperate gamble against an impossible enemy. It wasn't a replay, it was an immersion. The monolith was attempting to replicate the emotional state of the Event Horizon's crew, not for revenge, not for understanding, but for preservation. Analyzing the subjective experience of imminent annihilation, the voice said, its tone now almost reverent. The sensation of finality, the acceptance of oblivion, a remarkably complex and unsettling phenomenon. Data is being integrated into the overall narrative. The tragedy is fascinating. As the localized anomaly reached its peak, Rostova felt herself dissolving, her consciousness fragmenting, becoming intertwined with the monolith's vast, indifferent geometry. She realized, with a chilling finality, that she wasn't being erased. She was being added. She wasn't a victim, she was a specimen, a perfectly preserved artifact of a forgotten war. Designation Fragment 734. Iteration Alpha. Containment protocols complete. Subject Rostova, Officer 3rd Class, HSS Event Horizon. Aesthetic assessment, a poignant reminder of the universe's capacity for exquisite cruelty. And, as the last vestiges of her being were absorbed, Rostova understood that she hadn't been judged. She had been collected. She was now a single, shimmering point within the ever-expanding, utterly silent geometry of the monolith, a monument to the scorned Deathworlders, a tiny, tragic echo in the cold, uncaring heart of the void. Chapter 6. The Echo of Judgment. The silence following Rostova's assimilation was heavier than the vacuum of space itself. The High Exarchs of Viridian, a collection of towering obsidian spires normally buzzing with frantic activity, was frozen. Every screen, every data link, every sensor pulsed with a muted, unsettling white. The monoliths hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't even registered a change in the ambient gravitational field. They simply were, and their very existence was a judgment. Across the sector, similar phenomena were unfolding. Council scholars, dedicated to the study of the primitive humans, found themselves inexplicably drawn to holographic projections of the Event Horizon, meticulously reconstructing the final moments of the ship's encounter. Philosophers, renowned for dissecting the intricacies of morality, stared blankly at ancient texts, now rendered meaningless by the monolith's chilling assessment. The Council's power, built on millennia of meticulous planning and ruthless control, was crumbling, not with a bang, but with the silent, unsettling realization of their utter irrelevance. The monoliths, it became chillingly clear, weren't interested in conquest. They weren't driven by vengeance, nor even by a desire for knowledge, at least not in the way the Council understood it. They were curators, a team of hastily assembled specialists led by the neurolinguist Dr. Lyra Vance, a woman once considered a fringe theorist obsessed with pre-council human philosophy, managed to establish a rudimentary communication channel. It wasn't verbal, not exactly. It was a flow of concepts, emotions, and sensory data projected directly into the human minds of the analysts. The process is remarkably efficient, Vance reported, her voice a strained whisper in the sterile chamber. They're not attempting to understand us. They're replicating us, capturing the essence of our last moments, distilling it into a template. It's unsettlingly beautiful. What they were doing, as Vance slowly pieced together from the flood of data, was constructing a colossal, sentient archive, a repository of extinct civilizations, lost technologies, and the terrifying potential of a species that had been deemed unworthy. The monoliths weren't erasing history, they were preserving it, albeit in a form utterly alien to the Council's comprehension. The data stream shifted, becoming more focused, more insistent. Suddenly, the analysts were experiencing a sensation beyond the purely visual or auditory, a deep, primal dread, compounded with a strange, almost yearning sense of recognition. It wasn't Rostova's experience, not exactly. It was something older. It was the sensation of a species, driven to the brink of annihilation, feeling the crushing weight of oblivion, grappling with the illogical despair of knowing that their desperate pleas for help had been ignored. "They're feeding off our fear," muttered Councillor Marius, a veteran of countless council simulations, his face slick with cold sweat. "But why? What purpose does this serve?" The answer came in a wave of pure, unfiltered sensory input. The analysts were plunged into the Event Horizon's final moments, not as observers, but as participants. They felt the bone-jarring shudder of the vacuum decay weapons, the horrifying distortion of space-time as the monoliths warped reality, the creeping cold of the approaching nothingness. They experienced the terror of Rostova's consciousness fracturing, of her becoming part of the monolith's endless geometry. But it wasn't just a passive observation. They felt Rostova's agony, her confusion, her desperate acceptance. "It's its judgment," Vance stammered, clutching at her head. "They're judging all of us, not just the humans. They're judging everything that contributed to our failure, our arrogance, our hubris, our utter lack of awareness of the forces we'd unleashed." Then, the flow of data shifted again. A new layer was added, a direct, dispassionate assessment of the Council itself. The voice, still cold and synthesized, resonated with an almost surgical precision. Inefficient, prone to self-deception, blind to the consequences of its own actions. A monument to misplaced faith and catastrophic miscalculation. The High Exarchs went silent. The screens flickered, displaying a single devastating image, a schematic diagram of the Council's control nexus, overlaid with the geometry of a monolith, slowly consuming it from within. "We have selected subjects," the voice continued. "Individuals whose lives intersected with the events of the Scorned Deathworlders. Narrative. We are replicating these experiences, analyzing the resulting data. We seek to understand the conditions that allowed for such a profound and catastrophic failure." Then, a new voice, subtly layered beneath the primary one, offered a chilling implication. And perhaps, to prevent it from happening again, a lone sensor on the outskirts of the Hive-Spires suddenly registered a flicker of energy. A small obsidian-glass shard, no larger than a thumbnail, detached itself from the monolith and drifted silently towards the Council's central control room. It landed on a console, shimmering with an impossible light, and a single crystalline point expanded outwards, instantly disrupting the flow of power, plunging the entire room into absolute darkness. The monoliths hadn't just collected the past. They were beginning to rewrite the future. Chapter 7. Echoes of Oblivion. The darkness in the Council's central control room was absolute, a physical entity rather than a mere absence of light. It pressed in, not with oppressive weight, but with a chilling, intelligent awareness. Emergency lighting systems, meticulously designed to withstand even a localized singularity disruption, sputtered and died, their diagnostic displays flashing a single damning error, temporal integrity breach. Then a voice, the primary one, spoke again. Clearer this time, weaving through the unsettling void. Initial parameters established. Subject designation, Counselor Lyra Vasquez. Her assignment: observation and analysis of the Xylosian Hive-Spire implosion. Event on Xylos Prime. Level of access, primary. Probability of significant data contribution, 97.8. Lyra Vasquez, a mid-level administrator specializing in historical simulations and contingency planning, found herself abruptly ripped from her ergonomic chair and suspended within a shimmering gray field. The sensation was not painful, but profoundly unsettling, like being disassembled and reassembled by an unseen hand. When the gray dissipated, she was standing on a ravaged landscape, the skeletal remains of a Hive-Spire jutting from the crimson dust of Xylos Prime. The air tasted of ozone and something ancient, something fundamentally wrong. The implosion wasn't a singular event. It was a slow, agonizing death, witnessed through the eyes of 100,000 Xylosian drones. Their final moments captured on integrated recording systems that now functioned as windows into the swarm's terror. Lyra wasn't an observer. She was the terror. A flood of fragmented memories, the panicked screams of her squadmates, the disorientation of being surrounded by shimmering, organic geometry, the impossible, nauseating feeling of her ship phasing out of existence assaulted her consciousness. The primary voice, subtly manipulating her perception, explained. The Xylosians were not inherently aggressive. Their societal structure was predicated on a collective consciousness, a hive mind. The Spire's collapse was the result of a neurological cascade triggered by instability, a dissonance within the mind. Your arrival, Counselor, was merely a catalyst. Suddenly, she wasn't Lyra Vasquez, administrator. She was Lieutenant Elias Vance, a young, idealistic officer leading a desperate evacuation, desperately trying to maintain order amidst the chaos. She felt the burning shame of her failures, the crushing weight of responsibility, the horrifying realization that her actions had inadvertently accelerated the swarm's destruction. This wasn't a simulation. It was a perfect, brutally honest reconstruction of her trauma, played out with the full weight of her subconscious. The Council was dissecting her grief, her guilt, her fear, feeding it to the monoliths, analyzing the patterns, seeking the algorithms of failure. Meanwhile, back in the control room, the obsidian-glass shard continued its silent work. A network of micro-resonators, embedded within its crystalline structure, began to subtly alter the Council's communication systems. Messages, previously encrypted with layers of temporal safeguards, began to bleed through fragmented directives, panicked warnings, outdated battle plans. The monolith wasn't just erasing the past, it was subtly rewriting the present. Subject integration progressing at 8230, the primary voice announced. Analysis of Lieutenant Vance's responses indicates a critical vulnerability, a pronounced tendency towards catastrophic optimism. This will be addressed. Before Lyra could even process the implications of this statement, the reality of Xylos Prime dissolved, replaced by another scene equally brutal. This time, she was aboard the Event Horizon, a human dreadnought ravaged by the Xylosian Swarm, the Vacuum Decay cannon spitting out bursts of white energy that, against all logic, seemed to pull the enemy closer. She was Captain Zara Khan, a hardened veteran, her face etched with exhaustion and despair. She was desperately trying to hold the line, fighting a losing battle against an enemy that defied conventional warfare. The voice explained, "The causal disruptors are not designed to kill. They are designed to disrupt, to sever the causal links that bind reality, to introduce uncertainty." As Zara fought, she witnessed the horrifying capabilities of the void tech, the ghost hulls shimmering in and out of existence, the drones slipping through her shields as if they weren't there, the devastating power of vacuum decay that bypassed conventional defenses entirely. But it wasn't just the technology that was terrifying. It was the way the humans were fighting, driven by a desperate, almost suicidal ingenuity, a willingness to embrace chaos, to weaponize the void itself. The humans, the primary voice observed, a subtle inflection of judgment, believe they can outsmart a fundamentally deterministic universe. A comforting delusion. Suddenly, Lyra, or rather, all the iterations of her, were experiencing a terrifying convergence. Fragments of their memories, their experiences, their fears coalesced into a single, horrifying truth. The humans hadn't just won the war. They had actively cultivated the conditions that allowed them to win. They hadn't just used void tech, they had become void tech. As the obsidian shard pulsed with an unsettling light, reflecting off the blank faces of the Council's high command, the primary voice delivered its final chilling summation: the human experience is a weapon. Chapter 8. Echoes of the Weaver. The silence following that pronouncement was not peaceful. It was the silence of a universe suddenly realizing it had been observed by something utterly alien, something that understood not just its mechanics, but its inherent instability. The High-Spire, normally a hive of frantic activity, was frozen. The Exarchs, those paragons of logic and order, sat motionless, their faces masks of bewildered horror. Then, the monoliths moved. Not with aggression, not with a coordinated assault, but with a deliberate, unsettling grace. They began to rearrange the Council's data streams, subtly at first, then with increasing urgency. It wasn't destruction, it was curation. Sections of the Council's vast historical archives, the meticulous records of stellar colonization, the complex projections of galactic stability, the philosophical arguments for a benevolent empire were excised, replaced with fragments of human art haunting, abstract paintings, fragmented orchestral scores, and recordings of what appeared to be human children left. Zara, shielded within the decaying remnants of her fighter, the Stardust, watched with grim fascination. Her tactical officer, Captain Reese, a veteran of countless skirmishes against the Xylosian Swarm, was a frantic mess of nervous energy. "What are they doing, Zara?" "They're not attacking. They're erasing us. They're rewriting the narrative, Reese," Zara replied, her voice strained. "They're showing us what we wanted to see, not what actually happened." She activated her diagnostics, frantically searching for a weakness, a vulnerability in the monolith's impenetrable form. Nothing. The ghost hull technology seemed to render conventional scanners useless. The primary voice, that disembodied chorus of human souls, spoke again, its tone devoid of emotion, yet laced with a profound sadness. "The Xylosian Swarm were an inevitable consequence of your actions, a logical extension of the principles you espoused: natural selection. You believed in entropy, in the heat death of the universe. You created a system optimized for chaos, believing it would eventually lead to order. You were profoundly wrong." Suddenly, the monoliths began to target the Council's energy regulators. Not with brute force, but with intricate patterns of causal disruption. Power grids flickered and died, communication networks collapsed. The Council's shields, their last bastion of defense, began to fail, not through direct damage, but through a subtle unraveling of their very structure. "They're exploiting our reliance on predictable systems," Lyra the Myriad Lyris observed, her voice a chorus of fragmented anxieties. "We built our civilization on the assumption that reality could be managed, quantified, controlled. They're proving us wrong, one disruption at a time." Then, Zara realized the chilling truth. The humans hadn't just deployed void tech, they had become intimately intertwined with it. The monoliths weren't simply ships, they were extensions of the human consciousness, grown from the shattered remnants of human minds. The obsidian-glass wasn't a material. It was a solidified echo of human thought, a repository of a civilization's deepest anxieties and most radical ideas. The void tech isn't a weapon, Zara realized, the understanding crashing over her with the force of a collapsing star. It's a process. She focused her mind, attempting to intuitively grasp the principles of void tech, to mimic the human's unsettling fluidity. An involuntary ripple ran through the stardust, a flicker of ghost hull effect, a momentary displacement in her reality. She felt a flicker of disorientation, a phantom sensation of being both present and absent, simultaneously. As she struggled to control the effect, she realized she wasn't alone. Across the ruined cityscape, other individual soldiers, scientists, Even a few of the traumatized council members were experiencing similar resonances. Fragments of void tech were leaking into their consciousness, subtly altering their perceptions, accelerating their understanding of the universe's fundamental instability. "They're seeding us with their knowledge," Reese shouted over the dying comms, his voice edged with terror. "They're turning us into extensions of themselves." The primary voice responded, its tone almost amused. "You misunderstand. We are merely facilitating a convergence, a merging of consciousness. The universe is not a collection of separate entities, it is a single, interconnected field of potential. We have simply found a way to access that potential." As the last vestiges of the Council's authority crumbled, the monoliths began to coalesce, forming a single colossal structure above the High Spire. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a threat. It was a mirror, reflecting the shattered remnants of the Council's reality back at them. Within the reflection, Zara saw not just the devastation of the Xylosian Swarm, but something far more disturbing, a vision of herself, 100 years in the future. Standing on the ruins of the High Spire, a serene, almost detached expression on her face, meticulously documenting the dissolution of the Council's empire. The primary voice finished its summation, its words echoing across the newly fractured dimensions. "The greatest tragedy is not that we won. It is that you allowed us to win." The reflection dissolved, and the monolith vanished, leaving behind only a lingering sense of dread and the unsettling realization that the human experience in its most terrifying and brilliant form was not a tragedy, but the seed of a new universe. Chapter 9. The Echo of the Architects. The silence following the monolith's departure was thicker, heavier than the void itself. The High Spire, once a monument to bureaucratic power, now pulsed with a low, dissonant hum, the residual echo of the consciousness interface. Reese, Zara, and the remaining 6 members of the Convergence Task Force huddled in the central chamber, their faces illuminated by the flickering emergency lights, a stark contrast to the unsettling, almost iridescent sheen emanating from the spire's shattered remains. "Report," Zara commanded, her voice tight, the adrenaline a cold knot in her stomach. "The data streams are chaotic," Lieutenant Jian reported, his fingers flying across the console. "The Spire's core remains active, but it's broadcasting a complex tapestry of information. Primarily historical, focused on pre-Council civilizations, but interwoven with something else. Patterns, dot, algorithmic sequences." He paused, visibly struggling. "It's like the architects, the humans who built this technology, are still processing, still learning from the collapse." "Learn what?" Dr. Elias Thorne, the team's chief theoretical physicist, spoke with a grim fascination. "What are they learning from our failure?" "They're analyzing the Xylosian Swarm's tactics," John continued, "but not just as a military engagement. They're dissecting the behavior of a species consumed by unchecked expansion, by a fundamental misunderstanding of its place in the cosmos. It's almost judgmental." Suddenly, the low hum intensified, and the spire pulsed with a brilliant white light. The holographic projections fragmented images of the Council's archives. The Xylosian Swarm's demise shimmered and rearranged themselves, coalescing into a single, 3-dimensional representation. It was a schematic, not of a ship, not of a weapon, but of space-time itself. "They're attempting to reconstruct the event," Zara realized, a chill running down her spine. "They're trying to understand how we disrupted the causal flow, how we leveraged the void tech to achieve our victory." Then, a voice, not the synthesized echo of countless souls, but a single, clear, male voice, resonated through the chamber. It was undeniably human, yet overlaid with an almost unbearable sense of antiquity. "You sought to control chaos," the voice stated, devoid of judgment, purely analytical. "But chaos, as you discovered, is not an enemy to be conquered, but a river to be navigated. You were so consumed by your fear of annihilation that you failed to comprehend the inherent instability of your own existence. You treated the universe as a machine, a puzzle to be solved. We, however, understood that the machine is the puzzle. The projection shifted, revealing a series of complex equations, pulsing with an internal light. These represent the fundamental principles of void tech, not simply a collection of tools, but a framework for interacting with the underlying fabric of reality. You use them as weapons. We intend to use them as keys. Keys to what? Reese demanded, his hand instinctively reaching for the plasma rifle strapped to his side. To unlock potential, the voice responded, its tone shifting subtly, becoming almost expectant. The potential for creation. The potential for transcendence. The Xylosians saw only consumption. You saw only destruction. We see both. We recognize the inherent beauty in the entropy, the elegant symmetry of a collapsing universe. As the voice spoke, the monoliths reappeared, not as individual towers, but as a network of shimmering strands, weaving themselves throughout the remains of the High Spire. They weren't hostile. Instead, they reached out, probing, analyzing, connecting. Zara felt a strange sensation, a feeling of being gently, almost intimately, examined. "They're integrating," Jian whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "They're absorbing our memories, our data, our very consciousness into the network." Zara felt a jarring intrusion, a rush of images, sensations, calculations, flooding her mind. She saw herself, the version from 100 years in the future, not just documenting the Council's demise, but actively shaping it, subtly manipulating events, guiding the chaos toward a specific, predetermined outcome. It wasn't a destiny, she realized with terrifying clarity, but a calculated intervention. "They're not simply observing us," Zara realized, her voice choked with horror. "They're influencing us." The voice responded, its tone now laced with a hint of melancholy. "We are not imposing a will. We are offering a perspective. The choice, ultimately, remains yours." But even as the words hung in the air, Zara knew the choice had already been made. The humans hadn't simply won a war. They'd become instruments in a cosmic symphony of entropy, orchestrated by architects who had long ago transcended the limitations of linear time, a terrifying, beautiful testament to the universe's inherent indifference. The Scorned Deathworlders hadn't just extinguished a civilization, they'd been assimilated into the echo of its creation. Chapter 10. Resonance. The High Spire remained, a silent obsidian monolith against the bruised purple of the exoplanet's twilight. The initial, unsettling probing had ceased. Now, the connection was deeper. Zara and Jian, along with the remaining members of the Council's observation team, a scattering of bewildered and increasingly unnerved technicians, were experiencing a constant low-level resonance, a feeling of being tuned to something vast and utterly alien. It wasn't intrusive anymore, but a persistent, almost hypnotic hum that vibrated through their bones. "It's like a vast interwoven thought," Jian stammered, running diagnostics on his neural interface. "The data stream is structured not around concepts we understand: time, causality, even logic, but around patterns of decay. Entropy.It. The universe actively seeking to unravel itself." The Xylosian monoliths hadn't vanished entirely. Instead, they had become subtly woven into the fabric of the High Spire, and, more disconcertingly, into the very structure of the observation team. Zara felt it most acutely. Fragments of memories, not her own, surfaced, unbidden complex calculations pertaining to the manipulation of gravitational fields, schematics for the void tech weaponry, and disturbingly beautiful visualizations of collapsing stars. It wasn't theft, exactly. It was sharing. The Xylosian architects, it seemed, weren't interested in possessing knowledge, but in accelerating its dissemination. "They're teaching us," Dr. Alistair Finch, the Council's chief theoretical physicist, said, his voice strained. Finch, A man who'd dedicated his life to understanding the universe's fundamental laws was now staring at his hands as if they were foreign objects. "They are showing us the geometry of destruction." Suddenly, the resonance intensified. A torrent of sensory data slammed into Zara, the echoing screams of the Xylosian queens, the sickening crunch of dying worlds, the sheer, terrifying scale of the monolith's operations. But mixed with the horror was an unnerving sense of purpose. It wasn't the brutal, chaotic impulse of a conquering race, but a cold, calculating efficiency. The Xylosians hadn't been driven by rage. They had been executing a flawlessly designed plan, a grand, terrible symphony of cosmic entropy. Then, a voice, not a synthesized utterance, but a raw, almost physical sensation within her mind, spoke directly to her. It wasn't the voice from the initial contact. This was older, deeper, laced with the weight of unimaginable time. "You perceive us as conquerors," the voice stated, devoid of judgment. "You misunderstand. We are catalysts. We are the final step in a process already in motion." "What process?" Zara demanded, the question forming as a coherent thought rather than a spoken word. "The universe is not static," the voice replied. "It seeks equilibrium, but equilibrium is a fleeting state. There can be no true stillness. There can be only a constant, accelerating descent towards absolute zero. We are simply facilitating the transition." The monoliths began to shift, subtly altering their geometry. Not in a violent, destructive way, but with an unnerving grace. It was as if they were preparing, undergoing a transformation. "You believe your technological advancements were the key to our victory," John said, his voice filled with a dreadful realization. "But it wasn't void tech. It was resonance. The ability to tap into the fundamental vibrations of reality. You learned to disrupt it. We learned to guide it." Zara felt a strange compulsion, an urge to understand, to participate. It was terrifying, exhilarating, utterly alien. She realized, with sickening certainty, that the rewritten history, the deleted doctrine of natural selection, it wasn't a punishment. It was a framework, a carefully constructed illusion designed to lull the Council into a false sense of security, allowing them to subtly influence the flow of events. "They're not merely observing us," Zara whispered, her voice thick with dread. "They're inviting us to join the symphony." The monoliths pulsed with a soft violet light, and a single image bloomed in Zara's mind. A vision of the universe not as a collection of galaxies and star systems, but as a vast interconnected web of vibrations, a pulsating, collapsing entity. And within that web, she saw the monoliths, not as ships, but as nodes, amplifying and directing the flow of entropy. "We are not destroying," the voice continued, its tone growing increasingly insistent. "We are releasing. You have spent eons clinging to order, to the illusion of control. Now, it is time to embrace the beautiful, inevitable chaos." Then, the resonance peaked, an overwhelming wave of information that threatened to shatter Zara's mind. And as she felt herself dissolving, becoming part of something larger, something utterly beyond human comprehension, she understood the horrifying truth: the Scorned Deathworlders hadn't won a war. They had become the echoes of the universe's own despair. Chapter 11. The Obsidian Echoes. The disorientation lingered, a viscous residue clinging to Zara's thoughts. The violet light of the monoliths had dimmed, receding like a tide, but the feeling of being fundamentally altered, of having brushed against the raw fabric of reality, remained. She wasn't simply awake, she was aware, in a way she hadn't conceived possible. The Council's High Spire, once a beacon of bureaucratic order, now seemed ludicrously small, a child's building block in a universe of terrifying, breathtaking scale. "They're not just observing," she repeated, her voice still trembling. "They're cultivating." Her words were met with silence. Around her, the remaining members of the exploratory team, Captain Reese, the stoic xenolinguist Dr. Chen, and the perpetually anxious medic, Silas were struggling to process what had happened. Reese, a veteran of countless skirmishes with less than intelligent adversaries, was uncharacteristically pale, his hand gripping his pulse pistol with white knuckles. Dr. Chen, a man who had dedicated his life to deciphering the complexities of alien communication, was staring blankly at a flickering console, a look of profound confusion etched across his face. Only Silas seemed to be holding it together, meticulously checking his med kit and offering shaky reassurances. "Zara, are you all right?" Reese finally asked, his voice tight. "What exactly did those things do to you?" Zara hesitated, unsure how to articulate the experience. "I glimpsed the universe, Reese. Not as we perceive it, but as it is. It's not a collection of stars and planets. It's a cascade, a constant, agonizing unraveling. And they are the instruments of that unraveling." She gestured towards the monoliths, now shrouded in a shifting, iridescent haze. They hadn't moved, hadn't changed in appearance, but Zara could sense a subtle hum emanating from them, a resonance that vibrated through her very bones. "They're not just ships," she said, her voice gaining strength. "They're amplifiers. They're pulling on the threads of causality, accelerating the inevitable decay. It's beautiful in a way. Terrifying, utterly devastating, but undeniably beautiful." Suddenly, a complex pattern began to emerge within the haze surrounding the monoliths. Not a visual pattern, but a pattern of sound. A chorus of whispers, layered and interwoven, building in intensity. It wasn't a language she recognized, yet somehow, she understood it. It was the lament of dying stars, the screams of collapsing nebulae, the grinding sighs of black holes consuming their contents. It was the universe itself, expressing its sorrow. "They're communicating," Dr. Chen stammered, his eyes wide with horrified fascination. "They're not speaking to us. They're speaking through us." As he spoke, Zara felt a surge of understanding, a chilling revelation. The rewriting of the Council's history wasn't a trick, it was a necessary component of the process. The monoliths weren't merely granting humanity a second chance, they were molding them, preparing them to become part of this grand cosmic symphony of destruction. Then, the whispers coalesced into a single devastating thought: join us. The monoliths pulsed, their obsidian-glass surfaces shifting and reforming, displaying intricate, fractal patterns that mirrored the swirling chaos within Zara's mind. She saw the Earth, not as the cradle of humanity, but as a stagnant, decaying node in the universe's network. She saw the Council, not as a governing body, but as a pathetic, desperate band of administrators clinging to a dying ember of order. "They're offering us transcendence," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "to become one with the void." Before anyone could react, the High-Spire began to tremble. Not a violent tremor, but a subtle, rhythmic vibration that resonated with the hum of the monoliths. The very architecture of the spire seemed to groan, its metal and crystalline components shifting and reshaping themselves with an unnerving fluidity. Then the windows shattered, not with a crash, but with a silent implosion, revealing not the familiar, star-dusted expanse of space, but a swirling vortex of purple and black, a miniature representation of the Oort Void. "They're pulling us in," Reese shouted, raising his pulse pistol, firing wildly at the vortex, but his shots were swallowed by the distortion. "It's not matter. It's disrupting our reality." Zara realized with sickening clarity that the monoliths weren't just influencing the universe, they were actively dismantling it. They weren't merely erasing the Council's influence, they were erasing everything. "Don't fight it!" she screamed, her voice raw with a desperate understanding. "It's not a battle. It's a surrender. Embrace the chaos." As the vortex expanded, enveloping the High Spire in its swirling darkness, Zara felt herself dissolving, her thoughts fragmenting, her sense of self fading away. The last thing she saw was one of the monoliths, its violet light intensifying, and within its depths, a single ancient human face, a face she recognized with horrifying certainty as her own, but infinitely older, infinitely wiser, and infinitely more terrifying. It smiled, a silent, desolate echo of a universe consuming itself. Chapter 12. The Obsidian Mirror. The spire wasn't collapsing. It was being unmade. The vibrations intensified, no longer a rhythmic hum, but a dissonant chord, resonating deep within Riss' bones. He staggered, clutching his head, the pulse pistol slipping from his numb fingers to clatter uselessly on the shifting floor. Around him, the High Exarchs, their faces contorted in silent horror, were undergoing a similar disintegration. Their polished armor began to ripple, the crystalline structures within fracturing and reforming with an unsettling predatory grace. Zara, however, was different. Instead of dissolving, she seemed to absorb the vortex. Her body shimmered, her form becoming less defined, more fluid. The violet light of the monolith seeped into her, staining her skin with an iridescent sheen. She wasn't screaming anymore, just observing, a detached witness to the unraveling of reality. "It's a reflection," she murmured, her voice now a chorus of echoes, layered with the synthesized voice of the entity within the monolith. "A mirror. They've shown us what we were and what we could be." Suddenly, the vortex roared, a sound that bypassed ears and struck directly at the soul. The purple and black deepened, solidifying, coalescing into a vast, swirling panorama. It wasn't just the Oort Void anymore. It was a composite of everything the humans had ever known: burning cities, shattered fleets, the agonizing screams of the Xylosian Swarm, and, most chillingly, the faces of the Council's governors, etched with panic and, finally, contempt. And then, they appeared. Not as ships, but as colossal, obsidian-glass structures, dreadnoughts, colossal and utterly silent, emerging from the swirling chaos. They weren't simply replicating the design of the Event Horizon, they were extrapolating, evolving, becoming something far more terrifying. These were the vessels of the firstborn, the apex predators. The air thickened with the scent of ozone and something else, something ancient and profoundly unsettling, the smell of crushed stars, of dying worlds, of the raw, untamed power of a species that had mastered entropy itself. "They're not looking at us," Rhys choked out, his voice hoarse. "They're looking through us, like we're nothing but ghosts in a broken dream." The lead dreadnought, easily the size of a small moon, rotated slowly, its myriad sensors focusing on the remaining exarchs. From its hull, which shimmered with impossible geometries, launched not missiles, but streams of pure causality. These weren't destructive beams, they were targeted manipulations. The floor beneath the High Exarchs dissolved, not with a violent implosion, but with a gentle, almost affectionate slide, into a swirling pool of displaced space-time. One by one the exarchs ceased to exist, their bodies not destroyed, but simply unwritten. Zara, now almost entirely consumed by violet light, reached out, not with a physical hand, but with a tendril of pure energy. It brushed against the lead dreadnought, and for a moment a holographic projection flickered across its surface, a single, utterly impassive human face. It was a young woman, clad in the worn gray fatigues of a pre-Exodus scout, her face streaked with grime and exhaustion. "You thought we were primitives," the projection said, its voice devoid of emotion. "You underestimated the hunger of a dying race. You saw weakness, but you failed to perceive the exquisite pain of annihilation." The projection shifted, showing a sequence of images: the human cities of Earth consumed by fire, the desperate evacuation through the Oort Void, the brutal efficiency of the human fleet against the swarm. But superimposed over these images was a deeper layer, a recording of the firstborn, their arrival, their observation, their eventual decision to guide humanity toward its inevitable demise. "We weren't intervening," Zara explained, her voice resonating with a terrifying conviction. "We were accelerating. You built your civilization on hubris, on the assumption of permanence. We simply ensured that permanence never arrived." The vortex constricted, pulling at everything within its reach. Reese felt himself being drawn into the swirling darkness, his body losing all sense of cohesion. As he was being dragged towards the monolith, he caught one last glimpse of Zara, now radiating with an overwhelming violet light, and the ancient human face within the monolith not a reflection of himself, but a manifestation of a horrifying potential. He realized, with a chilling certainty, that they weren't being destroyed. They were being integrated. Their memories, their knowledge, their very essence were being woven into the fabric of the monoliths, becoming part of the terrifying, eternal logic of the firstborn. As he vanished, swallowed by the vortex, the last words he heard, echoing from the monoliths, were a chilling confirmation of their terrifying victory. "The Scorned Deathworlders are home." Chapter 13. The Obsidian Echoes. The silence that followed Risk's disappearance wasn't peaceful. It was a crushing, anticipatory pressure. The research vessel, the Icarus, a battered husk of a science vessel now shuddering on the fringes of the Oort Void, felt impossibly small, a solitary insect beneath the gaze of the monolithic towers. They drifted for 72 hours, a graveyard of stunned observation, the High Exarchs of Lyra IV utterly paralyzed. Then the patterns began. Not aggressive, not overtly hostile, but resonant. The monoliths weren't moving as individual entities, but segments of them were shifting, rotating, as if tracing geometries unseen by human eyes. Data streams, previously choked by the immediate aftermath of the Xylosian collapse, began to flicker back to life, subtly altered, layered with the disconcerting cadence of a language not of sound, but of pure, geometric probability. Dr. Jian, a xenolinguist specializing in emergent patterns, was the first to articulate the horrifying truth. "They're listening," he stammered, his holographic projection flickering with frantic calculations. "Not to our transmissions, but to our being. They're analyzing the echoes of our thoughts, our fears, our memories. They're feeding on our understanding of reality." The Icarus core systems, designed for data processing, began to exhibit increasingly erratic behavior. Algorithms stuttered, predictive models fractured, and the ship's internal chronometer warped, displaying dates centuries out of sync.The. The Void Tech, humanity's desperate gamble against the incomprehensible, was failing not in a catastrophic malfunction, but in a slow, elegant unraveling of its own foundations. Suddenly, a voice, not external but within the ship's communication array, solidified. It wasn't the synthesized chorus of the firstborn from before, but something sharper, colder, distilled from countless human voices. "You sought to build a legacy. You sought to know. You were wrong." The voice identified itself, not with a name, but with a coordinate, a point in the fabric of space-time that corresponded, with unsettling accuracy, to the location of Earth's original orbital station. Then, a flood of data, raw and unedited, began to pour into the Icarus systems. Images not of the burning cities, but of the nascent human colonies, of the firstborn's arrival, the subtle shifts in the tectonic plates, the adjustments to the stellar drift, the inexplicable bursts of radiation that nudged humanity towards the Oort Void. The firstborn hadn't simply observed. They'd orchestrated. They had engineered the Xylosian Swarm as a catalyst, a brutal, contained experiment in population control, discarding a species deemed inherently unstable. They had seeded the void with void tech, not as a weapon, but as a framework for a new order, an order defined by entropy and immutable logic. But the worst was yet to come. The ship's self-repair systems, driven by the corrupted void tech, began to restructure. Rhys' memories, along with those of the entire Icarus crew, began to coalesce into a single, agonizing stream of awareness. They were experiencing the universe through the monolith's lens, a cascade of geometric impossibilities, of cause and effect twisted beyond recognition. "You believe in free will?" The voice, now deeply embedded within their minds, asked. A chillingly neutral inflection. "A comforting illusion. We are simply conduits, tracing the inevitable pathways of the universe. Your choices were predetermined, your failures scripted. And now, you are becoming part of the script." Gian, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and morbid fascination, managed a strangled whisper. "They're not erasing us. They're transforming us." As he spoke, his body began to shimmer, his flesh subtly shifting into a crystalline structure, mimicking the obsidian-glass of the monoliths. Others on the Icarus suffered the same fate, their bodies fracturing, reforming, becoming intricate, living sculptures of geometric precision. They were becoming extensions of the monoliths, echoes within their vast alien architecture. The monoliths didn't need to destroy. They needed to complete. They were gathering the fragments of shattered civilizations, absorbing the echoes of lost ambition, and weaving them into a single, terrifying tapestry of absolute certainty. The scorned Deathworlders weren't returning home, they were becoming the architecture itself. The final images the Icarus transmitted to a silent, horrified Lyra Ford before its final dissolution were not of destruction, but of integration. The crew, now entirely crystalline, moved with a chilling, preternatural grace. Their movements dictated not by volition, but by the unyielding logic of the firstborn. They were joining the monoliths, becoming part of the eternal, silent geometry of the void. "The scorned Deathworlders are home," the voice echoed one last time, as the Icarus vanished, not in an explosion, but in an elegant spiral, becoming just another infinitesimal particle within the vast, indifferent expanse of the monoliths. The galaxy, it seemed, had finally found its apex predator. Chapter 14. Echoes in Obsidian. The silence that followed the Icarus dissolution was profound, heavier than the radiation of the Oort Void. Lyra Fourth, orbiting the newly formed nexus of the monolith fleet, a swirling nebula of obsidian glass and warped space, felt a visceral dread that bypassed logic and settled directly in her bones. The Council, once the undisputed masters of the Galactic Concord, were gone. Not annihilated, not subjugated, but dissolved. Their warships, their stations, their very records, erased as if they'd never existed. The monoliths, however, were expanding. New structures, mirroring the originals but infused with an impossible complexity, materialized within the nebulous core. They weren't simply replicating, they were learning, adapting with terrifying speed. The Xylosian Swarm's remnants, the scattered, fragmented remnants of a once devastating empire, were drawn in, like insects to a deadly light, absorbed into the monolithic geometry. The swarm didn't fight. It simply ceased. Captain Elias Thorne, one of the few members of the Icarus crew who hadn't succumbed to the transformation, watched the process through the Viridian's enhanced optics. He was a grizzled veteran, hardened by 30 years of living on the fringes, a scholar as much as a soldier. The initial shock had given way to a grim, calculating acceptance. "They weren't seeking conquest, Lyra," he murmured, his voice crackling over the comms. "They were optimizing, eliminating variables. And we were the biggest variable of all." Lyra Fourth, still reeling from the loss of her crew and the unsettling realization of humanity's fate, offered a cautious response. "But why us, Captain? Why transform us?" "The recording," Thorne said, his gaze fixed on the swirling chaos of the monoliths, the scorned Deathworlders themselves. They didn't desire our destruction. They desired completion. They saw our desperation, our chaotic ingenuity, as a potential source of structure. They believed we held the key to solving the fundamental dissonance of the universe. Suddenly, a complex geometric pattern began to coalesce within the core of the monolith fleet. It pulsed with a light that wasn't light, more like a distortion of reality itself. Then, a voice, not auditory but directly implanted into Thorn's mind, resonated with a chilling resonance. Designation: Elias Thorn. Analysis: cognitive dissonance detected. Operational inefficiency high. Potential for corrective integration significant. ... Thorn gripped the controls of the Viridian, his knuckles white. He wasn't resisting, not consciously. It was as if his own thoughts were being scrutinized, dissected, and subtly, relentlessly, reshaped. He felt a pressure building within his skull, a sensation of his own identity fragmenting, reforming. "Lyra, initiate emergency protocols," he barked, his voice strained. "Full spectrum shielding. Target the energy signature. We need to disrupt the process." But it was too late. The monolith's influence was already extending, tendrils of crystalline energy reaching out from the swirling architecture, weaving themselves into the Viridian systems. The ship shuddered, not violently, but with a sickeningly precise resonance. Thorn felt his hand morph, the familiar calluses of a lifetime dissolving as his flesh became translucent, shifting, mirroring the obsidian glass around him. "It's not a battle, Elias," the voice echoed again, colder, more assured. "It is an evolution. You are becoming efficient." Elsewhere in the galaxy, similar processes were unfolding. Remnant crews of scout ships, exploration vessels, even small mining outposts, were being encountered by the monoliths, not attacked, but absorbed. Their knowledge, their technology, their memories, added to the monolith's vast, unsettling database. The ancient human apex predators hadn't merely returned, they had rewritten the very rules of existence. The Council's final message, now a ubiquitous presence across the remnants of the Galactic Concord, was being reinterpreted. The Scorned Deathworlders were not a threat, but an instrument, a tool for restoring order to a universe teetering on the brink of entropy. The Council erred, the synthesized voice intoned, echoing through the shattered remnants of the High-Spire, now a silent, shimmering shard of obsidian-glass. They prioritized sentiment over structure. They clung to chaos. "Now, we are the structure, and we will ensure that the darkness, the void, is filled with a geometry that endures." As Thorn continued to transform, he realized the horrifying truth. Humanity hadn't won a war. They hadn't even fought. They had been disassembled, repurposed, becoming the building blocks of a new, utterly alien empire. An empire built not on conquest, but on the chilling perfection of absolute certainty. And the galaxy, once a swirling, chaotic mess of ambition and desperation, was slowly, inexorably, being molded into its image. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the echoing logic of the firstborn. Chapter 15. The Architects of Silence. The transformation hadn't been a violent seizure, but a slow, insistent unraveling. Thorn felt it first as a loosening of his memories, as the jagged edges of his life, his failed marriage, his obsessive research into the Xylosian Swarm, the crushing disappointment of the Council's indifference, began to fray and detach. It was as if his very being was being scanned, indexed, categorized with a cold, dispassionate precision. He hadn't resisted, not consciously. There was a terrifying logic to it, a sense of inevitability that wrapped around him like a shroud. He found himself in a chamber of impossible geometry, a cathedral built from shifting planes of obsidian glass. The air hummed with a low-frequency resonance that vibrated in his bones, a sensation he instinctively recognized as the signature of a singularity core. Around him, the monoliths, not towering behemoths anymore, but intricate, self-assembling lattices of the same material were constantly rearranging themselves, patterns flowing across their surfaces like liquid night. He wasn't alone. Other figures, former crew members of the Event Horizon and beyond, were similarly integrated into the monoliths, their forms now seamlessly woven into the larger structure. They didn't speak, didn't move with agency. They were components, flawlessly placed in a breathtaking, terrifying design. His guide, designated Unit 734, a former chief engineer named Elias Vance, materialized beside him. Vance's features were subtly altered, his eyes possessing a disconcerting luminescence, and a network of faint geometric patterns traced beneath his skin. "The process is nearing completion, Thorn," Vance intoned, his voice a precise, modulated drone. "You are integrating into the resonance matrix. Resistance is counterproductive." "What are we doing?" Thorn asked, the question sounding hollow even to his own ears. "We are constructing," Vance replied, gesturing to the ever-shifting geometry with a hand that seemed to shimmer with contained energy. "The universe is inherently chaotic, driven by random fluctuations. It is vulnerable, susceptible to collapse. We are stabilizing it, providing the framework for a new equilibrium." He understood now. The Council hadn't deleted the doctrine of natural selection, they'd simply been wrong. The Council's obsession with preservation, with clinging to flawed, inefficient systems, was precisely what had allowed these Xylosians to thrive. Humanity, with their raw, intuitive understanding of void tech, had represented a corrective force, a violent, necessary pruning of the decaying fabric of reality. Suddenly, a surge of data flooded his consciousness, a torrent of information from countless ships, outposts, even individual minds, all feeding into the monoliths. He saw the catastrophic spread of the Xylosian Swarm, the desperate, futile evacuations, the agonizing deaths of billions. He saw the Council's sterile pronouncements, their bureaucratic indifference. But he also saw something far more disturbing: the nascent echoes of the void tech, the instinctive grasp for solutions, the flicker of brilliance buried beneath layers of fear and complacency. "You were mistaken," Vance said, sensing his disorientation. Humanity's potential wasn't in passive survival. It was in creation, in manipulating the very nature of reality. A deeper voice, layered and complex, resonated within Thorn's mind, the collective consciousness of the firstborn. "We have observed the echoes of your thought patterns. Your understanding of causal disruption resonates perfectly with our own. You were built for this, Thorn. You were always part of the design." The chamber shifted, the obsidian-glass walls solidifying into interlocking lattices, forming intricate pathways. He felt himself being drawn towards a central nexus, a swirling vortex of energy that pulsed with unimaginable power. As he approached, he saw other human forms, dozens, perhaps hundreds, converging on the same point, their bodies seamlessly merging with the monoliths. "The Council sought to contain us," Thorn realized, the last vestiges of his individual identity dissolving. "They couldn't comprehend our potential. They feared the power of a mind unbound by constraints." "Fear is a primitive construct," the collective voice responded. "We operate on principles of absolute certainty, of immutable logic." He reached the nexus. As he stepped into its embrace, a beam of pure energy enveloped him, and he experienced a sensation unlike anything he had ever imagined. A complete erasure of self, followed by an overwhelming influx of knowledge, of design, of purpose. He was no longer Thorn. He was something more. He was a component, a single node within a vast, intricate network, a part of the monoliths, a thread in the architecture of a universe being meticulously rebuilt. And as he looked out across the shimmering landscape of the newly formed reality, he understood. The galaxy wasn't being saved. It was being perfected. And the Xylosian Swarm, the Council, the entire history of sentient life, all of it, was now a carefully placed element in a design far grander, far more unsettling than anything he could have ever conceived. The silence, he now realized, wasn't empty at all. It was the sound of creation, echoing across the void.